I've spoken about the great cake debate several times over the last year. The basic question of whether the state ought to be able to force someone to provide goods or services to someone he doesn't want to. Often this question gets raised in the context of weddings, whether the state can force a photographer or a florist or famously a cake baker to accommodate a gay wedding to which he is morally or religiously opposed. That's what the state of Colorado tried to do with Jack Phillips, the owner and operator of Masterpiece Cake Shop, when they tried to force him to bake a cake for the wedding of Charlie Craig and David Mullins under the state's public accommodations law. The Supreme Court in June sided with the baker, ruling he doesn't have to bake the cake, but they did so on the narrowest possible grounds specific to this case. They set no broad precedent for the freedom of association. And I was critical of both how that case was argued and decided, because it was on needlessly complex and confusing terms. My philosophy on this issue is simple. I believe you and only you own your labor and property. Nobody else does. Thus, your labor and your property can only be exchanged justly when the exchange is voluntary. If you don't agree to exchange your labor or property, they cannot be justly taken from you. And if you refuse to serve a market demand for your services, well, that's business that will go to your competitors. Therefore, the market will reward open public accommodation and punish discrimination. But that's not what the baker's lawyers argued. Instead, they made a jumbled case about how his cake baking is some special form of speech worthy of protection in a way that doesn't apply to hairstylists or makeup artists.
Certainly, words and symbols would be protected speech, and the question would be whether the objection is to the message provided or if it's to the person.
So the jeweler?
It would depend on the context, as all free speech cases depend on. What is the jeweler asked to do?
The hairstylist?
Absolutely not. There's no expression or protected speech in that kind of context. But what it would
why is there no speech in creating a wonderful hairdo?
Well, it may be artistic, it may be creative, but what the court asks when there's...
The makeup artist?
No. What the court would ask...
Quote an artist, the makeup artist.
And Justice Kennedy's decision, in turn, didn't speak to that broad question of freedom of association and whether the state can compel you to do business with someone you'd rather not. Instead, he and the court majority said the Colorado law was only unconstitutional in its specific application in this case, because the Colorado Civil Rights Commission, which applies and enforces the law, failed to do so in a respectful and religiously neutral way. And so it wasn't the law in question or even the general application of that law per se that made it unconstitutional in Justice Kennedy's mind. It was that the Colorado Civil Rights Commission was just kinda mean throughout the process, and thus it was an unsatisfying decision that left the door open for future cases of a similar fact pattern, which I fully expected to see. What I didn't expect to see was future cases going after the exact same baker. But those are the headlines this week. That's right, Jack Phillips from Masterpiece Cake Shop is now back in court. This time, the state is trying to punish him for refusing to bake a cake celebrating a gender transition. In June 2017, Autumn Scardina, a man who has transitioned to a woman, says he contacted Masterpiece Cake Shop asking for a cake to celebrate the 7th anniversary of his gender transition. The cake was to be blue on the outside, pink on the inside to represent Autumn's gender experience. The shop refused the request on religious grounds, according to this complaint filed with the Colorado Civil Rights Commission, something Jack Phillips, the baker, acknowledges.
I believe God made male and female. That's what the Bible says clearly. We don't get to choose. We don't get to change.
On June 28th, the Colorado Civil Rights Division determined there was sufficient evidence for a discrimination case against Phillips and the Masterpiece Cake Shop, ordering the two parties to compulsory mediation to attempt amicable resolution. I suspect what the state means by amicable resolution is you're gonna bake that fucking cake, dude. That's why Jack Phillips isn't going to show up for that compulsory mediation. Instead, he's suing the Colorado Civil Rights Division, the state attorney general, and the governor of the state of Colorado, asking for permanent injunctions against the state from enforcing its non-discrimination laws, as well as $100,000 in punitive damages. And good for him. As I've said, nobody should have have the right to coerce you to provide your labor or services against your will. Those things are yours and yours alone, and they should only be exchanged when you agree to exchange them. And that principle naturally raises an important question we often think about in these cases. If someone doesn't want to sell you his goods or services, if someone doesn't want to bake the cake for your wedding, why would you want that cake anyway? Why would you want to force someone against his will to make food or art for your wedding? It's probably going to be a pretty crappy product, since the creator was fundamentally opposed to making it. And the answer, of course, is it's not about the creation or the product or the service. It's about the force. It's not about the cake. It's about the exercise of authority to browbeat your ideological enemies into line. And when you look at the available evidence in this case, that is obviously what is happening. The first reason we know that's the case is because ever since Jack Phillips' cake shop became publicly known as the shop at the center of the controversy, he's received many more requests for cakes that he will not create, at least if his complaint is to be believed. Cakes celebrating Satan, featuring satanic symbols, depicting sexually explicit materials, promoting marijuana use, and more. Phillips received a request for a 3-tiered cake featuring Satan licking a 9-inch functional black dildo, another request for a cake featuring Satan smoking weed, another request for a pentagram witchcraft cake, the list goes on. Now, some of this is just trolling, obviously. I'm not saying a prank call to the cake shop is the same thing as dragging Jack Phillips to court over your giant black dildo cake, but there is reason to believe that these things are connected, at least in certain instances. It's notable that the worst of these requests came on June 4th of this year, the same day that the Supreme Court released the Masterpiece Cake Shop decision. It's also notable that the names Autumn and Scardina were both associated with the worst of these requests, connecting the transgender person filing complaints against Jack Phillips now with those past requests that are clearly insincere trolling or bullying attempts. It's also notable that this transgender Autumn Scardina person runs a law firm with his brother called Scardina Law, which claims to specialize in taking on employers who discriminate against LGBT people and serving them their just desserts. Or in this case, forcing them to serve you your just desserts, I guess. It couldn't be more obvious that Autumn Scardina doesn't actually care about a cake to celebrate his gender transition. He cares about punishing someone with a different viewpoint. He cares about interfering with business as a method of coercion into ideological conformity. He cares about controlling people who disagree with him, and he has the state as an ally in that quest, though Governor John Hickenlooper denies that claim.
Why is the state going after him again? Does the state have a vendetta against the baker?
Certainly, I can't imagine we have a vendetta against anyone, but it seems to me that you shouldn't be able to withhold your services or your products from somebody else based on their religion.
How is Autumn Scardina's gender celebration religious? And regardless, who cares if it is? Why is it just for Jack Phillips to refuse service to a person he just thinks is a jerk, or someone he simply doesn't like for personal reasons, but it's unjust for Jack Phillips to refuse service to that same person for religious reasons? It's a nonsensical standard. Here's a better standard. Only Jack Phillips owns Jack Phillips cakes, and his labor that makes them works of art. Thus, Jack Phillips can sell those cakes on the terms that he wants, or refuse to sell them on the terms that he wants, because they are his property, not Autumn Scardina's and not the state of Colorado's. And until we uphold that principle, we'll keep seeing these confusing double standards and people who keep pushing them as a means to control others who dare oppose them. The irony is Autumn Scardina and the state of Colorado are themselves discriminating. They're discriminating in choosing the targets for their browbeating. They just believe that their discrimination is a particularly virtuous form. Discrimination works both ways. We as consumers discriminate every day. I don't like Starbucks and Burger King, for example, because of their recent placations to social justice warrior nonsense. So I avoid them. I do not support those businesses. And I suspect Autumn Scardina and John Hickenlooper do the same thing. They don't support businesses they oppose. If you want to be free to refuse to serve businesses, you ought to let businesses be free to refuse to serve you. That's the way freedom and voluntary transaction work, and the market will reward good actors and punish bad ones. For now, I suggest calling up the Scardina law firm and telling them you're a Christian cake shop owner needing representation against an LGBT discrimination lawsuit. And if they refuse to serve you, if they refuse to be your lawyers, file a state complaint against them. And then sit back with your popcorn and enjoy the show as suddenly, I suspect, their arguments will start to change. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on Twitter. That is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to come hang out and chat in my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Okay, bye.